Thomas Mitchell pulled back the frozen blanket and found a baby barely breathing, its tiny lips already turning blue in the snow. As he lifted the dying infant into his arms, a massive white horse emerged from the blizzard and stood blocking his path, its dark eyes fixed on him with an intelligence that shouldn't exist in any animal. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and comment where in the world you're watching from. Let's go. The wind howled through the pine trees like a wounded animal, sending cascades of fresh snow tumbling from the heavily laden branches. Thomas Mitchell pulled his worn military jacket tighter around his chest, his breath forming small clouds in the frigid air. The winter storm had arrived earlier than the weather reports predicted, transforming the familiar forest trail into an unfamiliar white maze. He had been hiking through these Montana woods for nearly 2 hours, trying to clear his head from another sleepless night filled with memories he wished he could forget. Thomas was 42 years old, a veteran of 2 tours in Afghanistan, and for the past 3 years, he had been living in a small cabin on the outskirts of Whitefish. The town was quiet, the people kept to themselves, and that suited him just fine. After everything he had seen, everything he had been through, Thomas preferred the company of the mountains and forests to the chaos of civilian life. The wilderness demanded nothing from him except respect and caution. It didn't ask questions, it didn't judge, it simply existed, and in that existence, Thomas found a measure of peace he couldn't locate anywhere else. The snow crunched beneath his boots as he made his way along the narrow path that wound through the forest. He knew these trails well, had walked them countless times in all seasons, but today felt different. The storm had come on so suddenly, so fiercely, that even the forest seemed to hold its breath. The usual sounds of wildlife were absent, replaced only by the whistle of wind and the soft patter of snowflakes hitting the frozen ground. Thomas checked his watch. It was nearly 3 in the afternoon, but the sky was so dark with storm clouds that it might as well have been dusk. He needed to head back soon, before the trail became completely impassable. He had learned long ago not to underestimate nature's power. In the military, he had survived sandstorms, extreme heat, and enemy fire. But here, in the mountains of Montana, winter could be just as deadly as any battlefield. As he turned to retrace his steps, a sound caught his attention. It was faint at first, almost lost in the wind, but there was something about it that made him pause. Thomas stood completely still, his trained ears filtering through the noise of the storm. There it was again, a cry, weak and fragile but unmistakably human. His heart began to race. Out here in the middle of nowhere during a snowstorm, no sound should be human. The nearest house was miles away, and no one in their right mind would be out in this weather. Thomas moved toward the sound, his military training kicking in automatically. Every sense heightened, every muscle ready. He pushed through a thick cluster of pine branches, the needles scratching against his jacket, and emerged into a small clearing. What he saw made him stop in his tracks. Partially buried in the snow, nestled against the base of a massive fallen log, was a bundle of blankets. The cry came again, stronger this time, and Thomas's blood ran cold. He rushed forward, dropping to his knees beside the bundle. With trembling hands, he pulled back the layers of fabric, and there, red-faced and screaming against the cold, was a baby. The infant couldn't have been more than a few months old. The tiny face was flushed from crying, little fists waving in the air, but miraculously the child appeared to be relatively warm. The blankets, though damp from the snow, had provided some insulation. But Thomas knew that wouldn't last long. In these temperatures, hypothermia could set in quickly, especially for someone so small and vulnerable. His mind raced. Who would leave a baby out here? How long had the child been alone? Where were the parents? The questions tumbled through his thoughts, but he pushed them aside. Right now, answers didn't matter. What mattered was getting this baby to safety. Thomas carefully lifted the bundle, cradling the infant against his chest. The baby's cries subsided slightly at the warmth of his body. He unzipped his jacket and tucked the child inside, using his own body heat to warm the tiny form. The baby was so light, so fragile. Thomas felt a surge of protectiveness that surprised him with its intensity. He stood up, scanning the clearing for any signs of whoever had left the baby here. Footprints in the snow led away from the log, but they were already being filled in by the falling snow. Following them would be impossible, and even if he could, his priority now was getting the baby somewhere warm and safe. The nearest shelter was the Animal Rescue Center on the edge of town, about 5 miles away. It wasn't a hospital, but Sarah Chen, who ran the facility, was a trained nurse before she dedicated her life to rescuing animals. More importantly, the center had heat, supplies, and Sarah would know what to do. Thomas oriented himself, calculated the fastest route, and began walking. The journey was treacherous. The snow was falling heavier now, and the wind seemed determined to push him backward with every step. Thomas kept the baby pressed close to his chest, his arms aching from holding the position, but he didn't dare shift. Every few minutes he would check on the infant, relieved each time to hear the soft breathing, to see the tiny chest rising and falling. As he walked, Thomas couldn't help but think about the cruelty of whoever had abandoned this child. What desperation, what circumstances could lead someone to leave a baby in the snow? He had seen terrible things in war, had witnessed the worst of humanity, but somehow this felt different. This was an innocent life, helpless and alone, left to die in the cold. The thought made his jaw clench with anger. The baby stirred against his chest, making small mewing sounds. Thomas adjusted his hold, murmuring softly even though he knew the child couldn't understand his words. The sound of his voice seemed to comfort the infant, and Thomas found himself talking continuously, filling the silence with a steady stream of reassurance. The forest around them was transformed into a winter wonderland that would have been beautiful under different circumstances. Snow clung to every branch, creating intricate patterns of white against the dark bark. The world was muffled, quiet, as if holding its breath. But Thomas saw only potential danger. Every drift of snow could hide a hole or root. Every gust of wind could steal precious warmth from the baby he carried. His legs burned with effort as he pushed through the deepening snow. The trail had disappeared entirely now, covered by the fresh snowfall. Thomas navigated by instinct and memory, using the position of the trees and the lay of the land to guide him. He had to get this right. One wrong turn could add miles to the journey, and he wasn't sure how much longer the baby could survive in these conditions, even with the protection of his body heat. Time seemed to stretch and compress simultaneously. Each step felt like an eternity, yet when Thomas checked his watch, he was surprised by how much time had actually passed. The baby had grown quiet, and while part of him was relieved that the crying had stopped, another part worried about what that silence might mean. Finally, after what felt like hours but was likely only 40 minutes, Thomas spotted the first signs of civilization. The wooden fence that marked the boundary of the Animal Rescue Center emerged from the swirling snow like a beacon of hope. He quickened his pace, his exhausted muscles finding new strength in the proximity of safety. The rescue center was a sprawling property that Sarah Chen had built over the past decade. What had started as a small barn and a few acres had grown into a sanctuary for injured and abandoned animals of all kinds. Horses, goats, dogs, cats, even the occasional wild animal that needed rehabilitation before being released back into nature. Sarah had dedicated her life to this place, and the community respected her for it. Thomas pushed through the gate, leaving it open in his haste, and trudged toward the main building. Smoke rose from the chimney, a welcome sign that Sarah was home and the building was warm. He climbed the steps to the porch, nearly slipping on the ice that had formed there, and pounded on the door with his free hand. For a moment there was no response, and Thomas felt a flutter of panic. What if Sarah wasn't here? What if she had gone into town before the storm hit? But then He heard footsteps inside, and the door swung open to reveal Sarah's surprised face. She was a woman in her mid-50s, with silver-streaked black hair pulled back in a practical ponytail and kind eyes that had seen their share of suffering. Those eyes widened when she saw Thomas standing there covered in snow, his jacket bulging strangely at the chest. "Thomas, what on earth are you doing out in this weather? Come in, come in." Sarah stepped aside, ushering him into the warm interior. The heat hit Thomas like a physical force, and he realized just how cold he had become during the trek through the forest. "I need your help," Thomas said, his voice rough from the cold and exertion. He carefully unzipped his jacket, revealing the bundle pressed against his chest. "I found a baby. In the snow, near Rocky Creek Trail." Sarah's professional demeanor snapped into place immediately. She moved forward, her hands already reaching to assess the situation. "Bring the child to the examination room now." Her voice was calm but urgent, the tone of someone who had dealt with emergencies before and knew that every second counted. Thomas followed her through the main room, past the crackling fireplace and comfortable furniture, into what Sarah called her examination room. It was really a converted bedroom that she used for treating injured animals, but it was clean, warm, and well-equipped. Sarah cleared the examination table with a sweep of her arm, sending paperwork and supplies scattering to the floor. "Lay the baby here, gently." Sarah's hands were already moving, checking vital signs with practiced efficiency. As Thomas carefully placed the infant on the padded table, Sarah grabbed a stethoscope and began her assessment. The baby stirred at the change in position, letting out a weak cry that nevertheless filled Thomas with relief. A crying baby was a living baby. "How long was the child exposed?" Sarah asked, her fingers checking the baby's temperature, examining the skin for signs of frostbite. "I don't know," Thomas admitted. "I found the baby maybe 45 minutes ago, but there were footprints in the snow already being covered. Could have been there for an hour or more before I arrived." Sarah nodded, her face tight with concentration. She worked quickly, removing the damp outer blankets and wrapping the baby in warm, dry towels from a cabinet. She checked the infant's fingers and toes, looking for the telltale white patches that would indicate frostbite. She listened to the heart and lungs, felt the fontanelle, examined the umbilical cord stump. "This baby is maybe 6 weeks old," Sarah said after a few minutes. "Female, and incredibly lucky." "You got to her just in time, Thomas. Another hour out there and we'd be looking at a very different situation." Thomas felt his knees go weak with relief. He leaned against the wall, suddenly aware of how tired he was, how much the adrenaline had been keeping him going. Now that the baby was safe, his body wanted to collapse. Sarah continued her examination, but her movements became less urgent. "The baby is cold, but not dangerously so. No signs of frostbite. Breathing is good, heart rate is strong. She's dehydrated and probably hungry, but otherwise she seems remarkably healthy." Sarah looked up at Thomas, and there was a mixture of admiration and sadness in her eyes. "You saved her life." "Who would do this?" Thomas asked, the question that had been haunting him since he found the child. "Who would leave a baby in the snow to die?" Sarah's expression darkened. Desperation makes people do terrible things. Maybe it was someone who couldn't care for a child and thought this was the only option. Maybe it was someone with mental health issues who wasn't thinking clearly. We may never know. She wrapped the baby more securely in the warm towels, and the infant's crying began to settle into small whimpers. "We need to call the authorities," Sarah said, moving toward the phone on the wall. "Sheriff's Department, Social Services. They'll need to take custody of the child and try to find out where she came from." Thomas nodded, though something in his chest tightened at the thought of handing the baby over to strangers. He had only known this child for less than an hour, but already he felt connected to her in a way he couldn't explain. He had saved her life. That created a bond whether he wanted it or not. Sarah made the calls while Thomas stayed with the baby, watching the tiny chest rise and fall with each breath. The warmth of the room was making him drowsy, and he realized that his own clothes were soaked through with melted snow. He should change, get dry, but he couldn't bring himself to leave the examination room. "They're on their way," Sarah said, hanging up the phone. "But with the storm, it could be a while." Sheriff Morrison said the roads are already getting bad and they're advising people to stay home unless it's an emergency. She looked at the baby, then at Thomas. "This qualifies as an emergency, but it might be a few hours before anyone can get here." "That's fine," Thomas said, "as long as she's safe and warm." Sarah prepared a bottle of formula, warming it carefully before testing it on her wrist. She offered it to Thomas. "You want to feed her? You're the one who found her. You should have the honor." Thomas hesitated, then took the bottle. He had never fed a baby before, had no experience with children at all, but Sarah showed him how to hold the infant, how to position the bottle, and after a moment of fumbling, the baby latched on and began to drink eagerly. The sight of the tiny mouth working at the bottle, the feeling of the small weight in his arms, stirred something deep in Thomas's chest. Something he thought had died on the battlefields of Afghanistan. A sense of purpose. A sense that life, despite all its cruelty and randomness, still held moments of pure grace. Outside, the storm continued to rage, but inside Sarah's examination room, there was warmth and safety. The baby drank her fill and fell asleep in Thomas's arms, her tiny face finally relaxed and peaceful. Thomas looked down at her, this small life that had been thrown into his path, and wondered what it all meant. He wasn't a religious man, hadn't been for years, but sitting there with the sleeping infant, he couldn't help but feel that something larger than chance had been at work today. Sarah brought Thomas a cup of hot coffee and a change of dry clothes from the donation bin she kept for emergencies. The clothes were a bit too large, but they were warm and dry, which was all that mattered. Thomas changed in the bathroom, catching a glimpse of himself in the mirror. His face was red from the cold and wind, his hair disheveled, and there were dark circles under his eyes that spoke of too many sleepless nights. He looked older than his 42 years, weathered by experiences both recent and long past. When he returned to the examination room, Sarah had made a makeshift bed for the baby in a clean animal carrier lined with soft blankets. It wasn't ideal, but it was warm and safe. The infant slept peacefully, her little fingers curled into tiny fists. "You should eat something," Sarah said, gesturing toward the kitchen. "I made soup earlier. It's still warm." Thomas realized he was hungry. He had left his cabin that morning without breakfast, planning only a short hike to clear his head. That seemed like a lifetime ago now. He followed Sarah to the kitchen, a cozy space that smelled of herbs and wood smoke. She ladled thick vegetable soup into a bowl and set it before him with a slice of homemade bread. They sat in companionable silence for a while, the only sounds the crackling of the fire in the next room and the howl of wind outside. Sarah had always been good at giving people space, not pushing for conversation when silence was what they needed. It was one of the reasons Thomas felt comfortable around her. "How are you doing, Thomas?" Sarah asked finally, her voice gentle. "I mean really doing. I know you come out here to walk and think, but I worry about you sometimes. Living alone in that cabin, no family nearby." Thomas considered his answer carefully. Sarah was one of the few people in Whitefish who knew about his military service, though he had never gone into details about what he had experienced. "I'm managing," he said finally. "Some days are better than others." Sarah nodded, understanding in her eyes. Finding that baby today, that must have brought up a lot of feelings. Saving a life when you've seen so much death. Thomas felt a tightness in his chest. Sarah had a way of cutting through the defenses he had spent years building. "Yeah," he admitted, "it did. He stared into his soup, watching the steam rise. In Afghanistan, we were always too late. We'd get to a village after an attack, and there was nothing we could do but count the bodies. Finding that baby today, being able to actually save someone, it felt like maybe I could make up for something. "You can't make up for war, Thomas," Sarah said softly. "What happened over there wasn't your fault. You were doing your duty." "Duty doesn't bring back the dead," Thomas said, the words coming out harsher than he intended. He took a breath, steadying himself. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to snap." Sarah reached across the table and squeezed his hand briefly. "No apology needed. I understand more than you might think." Before Thomas could respond, a sound from outside made them both freeze. It was a loud thud, followed by what sounded like heavy breathing and the scrape of something against wood. Sarah stood up quickly, her face concerned. "That came from the stable area," she said, already moving toward the door. "One of the animals might be in distress." Thomas followed her, grabbing his jacket on the way. They stepped out onto the covered porch that connected the main house to the barn and stable area. The snow was falling so heavily now that visibility was reduced to just a few feet. Sarah grabbed a flashlight from a hook by the door and aimed it toward the stable. What they saw made them both stop in their tracks. Standing in the doorway of the stable, barely visible through the curtain of falling snow, was the largest horse Thomas had ever seen. But this was no ordinary horse. Even in the dim light and swirling snow, Thomas could see that this was a wild animal, untamed and magnificent. The horse was pure white, its coat almost glowing against the darkness of the storm. It stood at least 18 hands high, maybe more, with a flowing mane that whipped in the wind like a banner. The horse's eyes, visible even at this distance, were fixed on them with an intensity that was almost human. Steam rose from its nostrils in great plumes, and its massive hooves pawed at the snow-covered ground. Everything about the animal radiated power and presence. "My God," Sarah breathed. "I've never seen anything like it." Thomas felt his heart pounding. He had seen horses in Afghanistan, small hardy creatures that the locals used for transportation. He had seen horses on ranches here in Montana. But this animal was something entirely different. It looked like something out of legend, a creature that shouldn't exist in the modern world. The horse took a step forward, and Thomas instinctively moved in front of Sarah. His military training kicked in, assessing the threat. The animal was massive and could easily injure or kill them if it charged. But there was something in the horse's demeanor that wasn't aggressive. It seemed almost purposeful in its approach, deliberate rather than threatening. "Easy there," Thomas said, his voice low and calm. "We're not going to hurt you." The horse stopped, its ears swiveling forward as if listening to Thomas's words. For a long moment, human and animal regarded each other across the snowy expanse. Then, to Thomas's amazement, the horse turned its great head and looked directly at the main house, as if it could see through the walls to where the baby slept. "Sarah, does this horse belong to anyone around here?" Thomas asked, not taking his eyes off the animal. "Not that I know of," Sarah replied, her voice filled with wonder. "And I know every horse owner within 50 miles. Besides, look at it. That's not a domestic horse. It's completely wild." The horse took another step forward, then another. Its movements were slow and measured, as if it understood that sudden motion might frighten them. As it drew closer, Thomas could see more details. The horse's coat was thick, adapted for harsh winters, but there was also a sleekness to it that spoke of strength and health. This was not a starving wild horse struggling to survive. This was an animal in its prime, powerful and magnificent. "What does it want?" Sarah whispered. "I don't know," Thomas answered, "but I don't think it means us harm." The horse came to a stop about 10 feet away from the porch. This close, its size was even more impressive. Thomas estimated it had to weigh close to 2,000 pounds, all muscle and raw power. Yet there was an intelligence in its eyes that was unsettling. The horse looked at Thomas, then at the house again. then back at Thomas. "It's like it's trying to tell us something," Sarah said, her voice filled with awe. Thomas took a cautious step forward. The horse didn't move, just watched him with those intelligent, knowing eyes. Thomas had faced down enemy combatants, had stared death in the face more times than he cared to count, but somehow standing before this magnificent creature made him feel small and insignificant in a way that combat never had. The wind howled, sending another wave of snow across the yard. The horse shook its great head, mane flying, and then did something that made Thomas's breath catch in his throat. The animal turned and walked back toward the stable, then stopped and looked over its shoulder at them. It was an invitation, as clear as if the horse had spoken the words aloud. "It wants us to follow it," Thomas said. Sarah looked at Thomas with uncertainty written across her face, but there was also curiosity there, and perhaps a touch of the same inexplicable pull that Thomas felt. "Thomas, I don't think this is a good idea. That's a wild animal. We don't know what it wants or what it might do." Thomas understood her caution. Everything about the situation defied logic and common sense. Wild horses didn't approach humans like this, didn't make eye contact with such obvious intention, didn't wait patiently as if expecting to be followed. Yet despite all the rational reasons to stay put, Thomas felt compelled to see what the horse wanted. "I know it sounds crazy," Thomas said, keeping his voice low and steady so as not to startle the animal. "But look at it, Sarah. That horse isn't acting aggressive. It's acting like it wants to show us something, and after everything that's happened today, finding that baby against all odds, I'm not ready to dismiss anything as coincidence." Sarah considered this, her practical nature warring with something deeper, some instinct that whispered this moment was important. Finally, she nodded. "Okay, but we're careful. We stay together, and at the first sign of danger, we get back to the house. Agreed?" "Agreed," Thomas said. They descended the porch steps together, their boots crunching in the fresh snow. The horse watched their approach, utterly still except for the occasional flick of its ears and the steady rhythm of its breathing. As they drew closer, Thomas could see even more details. The horse's eyes were a deep, dark brown, almost black, and they held a depth of awareness that was frankly unnerving. This was no ordinary animal, wild or otherwise. When they were within a few feet, the horse turned and walked into the stable. Thomas and Sarah exchanged glances, then followed. Inside, the stable was warmer, protected from the worst of the wind and snow. Sarah's rescue horses, 3 older animals she had saved from slaughter, nickered softly from their stalls, but they didn't seem disturbed by the presence of the wild horse. If anything, they seemed calm, almost reverent. The giant white horse walked the length of the stable with purpose, its hooves making soft thuds on the straw-covered floor. It stopped at the far end, where Sarah kept supplies and feed, and turned to look at them again. Then, with a deliberate motion, the horse lowered its massive head and nudged a burlap sack with its nose. "What is it doing?" Sarah whispered. Thomas moved closer, cautiously, watching for any sign that the horse might strike out. But the animal simply stepped back, giving him room to approach the sack. Thomas knelt down and pulled the burlap aside. Underneath was a wooden crate, old and weathered, with strange markings carved into its surface. "Sarah, there's a crate here. Looks like it's been here a while." Sarah came closer, her flashlight beam illuminating the find. "I've never seen that before, and I know every inch of this stable." She looked at the white horse, who stood watching them with those intelligent eyes. "Did you put this here?" she asked the animal, knowing it was absurd to expect an answer. The horse made a soft sound, almost like a sigh, and pawed at the ground once. Thomas carefully lifted the crate. It was heavy, but not impossibly so. He carried it to the center of the stable where the light was better and set it down. The lid was secured with an old leather strap that had grown brittle with age. "Should we open it?" Sarah asked. Thomas looked at the horse, which watched them intently. The whole situation felt surreal, like something out of a dream. But his instincts, honed by years of military service, told him that whatever was in this crate was important. The horse had led them here for a reason. He unbuckled the strap and lifted the lid. Inside, wrapped in layers of oiled cloth, were several items. The first was a leather journal, its pages yellowed with age but still intact. Thomas carefully opened it and saw handwriting in fading ink. The entries were dated, the most recent from 15 years ago. Sarah leaned over his shoulder, reading. It's a diary of some kind. Look, there are entries about horses, about one horse in particular. Thomas turned the pages carefully. The writer, whose name was given as Margaret Harrison, had been documenting her experiences with a wild white horse she had encountered in these very mountains. The entry spoke of a creature of extraordinary intelligence and spirit, a horse that seemed to exist outside the normal bounds of nature. Margaret described how the horse had appeared to her during the darkest period of her life, when she was grieving the loss of her husband and considering ending her own pain. Listen to this, Thomas said, reading aloud from one entry. Today, the white one came again. I've started calling him Ghost because he appears and disappears like a spirit. He stood at the edge of the property for an hour just watching me work. I know people would say I'm crazy, that I'm seeing things that aren't there because of my grief. But I know what I see. This horse is real, and there's something about him that's different, something almost sacred. Sarah's eyes were wide. Margaret Harrison. I knew her, or knew of her. She ran this property before I bought it. People said she was a recluse, a bit strange. She died about 10 years ago, but I never knew much about her story. Thomas continued reading through the journal. Margaret's entries detailed years of encounters with the white horse. She described how the animal seemed to appear during moments of crisis or decision, how it had once led her to a lost hiker who would have died without intervention, how it had warned her of an approaching wildfire by its unusual behavior. The more Thomas read, the more extraordinary the story became. There's more in the crate, Sarah said, reaching in to pull out a bundle of old photographs. The images showed a younger Margaret standing beside the same white horse, though the photographs were grainy and aged. In each picture, the horse's size and presence were undeniable. Beneath the photographs was a letter, sealed in an envelope and addressed to whoever might find this crate. Thomas opened it carefully and began to read the flowing script. To the finder of this record, Margaret had written, "If you are reading this, then Ghost has led you here, which means there is someone who needs help. I don't know who you are or what your circumstances might be, but I know that Ghost only appears when there is a life to be saved or a wrong to be made right. I have spent 15 years trying to understand this magnificent creature, and I can only tell you what I have learned through experience. Ghost is not a normal horse. He is something more, though I cannot say what. He appears when he is needed, and he guides those who are willing to follow. Trust him. Follow where he leads, and know that you have been chosen for something important." Thomas looked up from the letter to find the white horse, Ghost, watching him with those profound eyes. The coincidence was too great to ignore. He had found an abandoned baby in the snow, had been led to this stable by this impossible horse, and now this letter telling him he had been chosen for something important. Sarah's hand trembled slightly as she reached out to touch Thomas's arm. "Thomas, this is beyond anything I can explain. That baby you found, this horse appearing, this letter. What does it all mean?" "I don't know," Thomas admitted, "but I think we're about to find out." The stable fell into silence as Thomas finished reading Margaret's letter. Outside, the storm continued its assault on the mountain, but inside this weathered building, surrounded by the warmth of horses and the presence of something inexplicable, Time seemed to have stopped. Sarah stood beside Thomas, her hand still resting on his arm, both of them trying to process what they had just discovered. Ghost remained motionless, watching them with patient intensity. The other horses in the stable had settled into a peaceful quiet, as if they too understood the gravity of the moment. Thomas carefully folded the letter and placed it back in the crate along with the journal and photographs. His mind was racing, trying to find rational explanations for what was happening, but every logical thought seemed to dissolve when he looked into Ghost's knowing eyes. "Sarah, I know how this sounds," Thomas began, choosing his words carefully. "But I think this horse, Ghost, I think he led me to that baby. I wasn't planning to go down Rocky Creek Trail today. I usually stick to the eastern paths, but something pulled me in that direction, some feeling I couldn't shake. And now this." Sarah nodded slowly, her scientific mind clearly struggling with the implications, but unable to deny what was right in front of them. "In all my years working with animals, I've seen remarkable things. I've seen dogs alert their owners to medical emergencies before any symptoms appeared. I've seen cats refuse to leave the side of patients who were about to pass away. Animals perceive things we don't understand. But this," she gestured toward Ghost, "this is something else entirely." Thomas approached the white horse slowly, extending his hand palm down in a gesture of peace and respect. Ghost lowered his massive head, allowing Thomas to touch the soft muzzle. The horse's breath was warm against Thomas's cold fingers, and up close, Thomas could see the intricate details of the animal's face. There were small scars along the neck and shoulders, marks of a life lived wild and free. But there was also a gentleness in the way Ghost accepted his touch, a willingness to connect that seemed almost human in its intention. "What do you want from me?" Thomas asked quietly, knowing he wouldn't receive an answer but needing to voice the question anyway. "Why did you lead me to that baby? What am I supposed to do?" Ghost pulled back slightly and turned toward the stable entrance, taking a few steps before stopping and looking back at Thomas. The message was clear. There was more to see, more that needed to be done. "He wants us to follow him again," Sarah said, stating the obvious because the situation was so surreal it needed to be spoken aloud to feel real. "The baby is safe and warm inside," Thomas said, thinking through the logistics. "We have time before the authorities arrive. If Ghost has something else to show us, I think we need to see it." They bundled up against the cold and followed Ghost out of the stable. The storm had intensified and visibility was down to almost nothing. But Ghost moved with confidence through the snow, his white coat making him visible even through the heaviest curtains of falling flakes. Thomas and Sarah stayed close together, following the massive horse as he led them around the side of the main building toward an area of the property that Sarah rarely used. "This is where Margaret's original cabin stood," Sarah called over the wind. "It burned down about a year before I bought the property. I never rebuilt it, just cleared the foundation." Ghost stopped at the edge of what must have been the old cabin site. Snow had buried most of the evidence, but Thomas could make out the outline of stone foundation walls poking through the white blanket. The horse pawed at the snow with one massive hoof, again and again, until he had cleared a small area. Beneath the snow was a flat stone, and carved into its surface were words. Thomas knelt down, brushing away more snow to read the inscription. Sarah directed her flashlight beam onto the stone, illuminating the carved letters. "Here lies the truth that sets us free. Seek not with eyes, but with the heart. The just shall know the path." "It's a grave marker," Sarah said, her voice barely audible over the wind. "But whose?" Thomas stood up, looking at Ghost for answers the animal couldn't provide in words. The horse made a soft sound, almost a groan, and pawed at a different section of the cleared ground. Thomas understood. He began digging through the snow with his hands, Sarah joining him. The ground beneath was partially frozen, but after several minutes of effort, they uncovered another stone. This one was smaller, rougher, and the carving on it was simple. Baby Grace, 3 days old. May she find peace. Oh my God, Sarah breathed. Margaret buried a baby here. Thomas felt his chest tighten. The pieces were starting to come together, forming a picture he didn't want to see but couldn't look away from. "The journal," he said. "We need to read more of it." They hurried back to the stable, Ghost following behind like a guardian. Inside, Thomas grabbed the journal and began flipping through it with more urgency, scanning the entries for anything about a baby. Sarah read over his shoulder, both of them searching for the connection that would make sense of everything. Thomas found it 3/4 of the way through the journal. An entry dated 18 years ago, written in handwriting that was shaky and barely legible. "Today I made the worst mistake of my life. Today I listened to fear instead of love. My daughter came to me, pregnant and terrified. Her boyfriend had abandoned her, and she had nowhere to go. I told her she couldn't stay. I told her she had to handle it on her own. I was thinking of my reputation, of what the town would say. I turned her away. 3 days later, they found her body in a motel room. She had given birth alone and bled to death. The baby, little Grace, lived for 3 days before she also passed. I will never forgive myself." The entry continued, describing Margaret's descent into grief and guilt. She had buried her granddaughter on her property, unable to bear the thought of the child being in a cold, impersonal cemetery. She had withdrawn from society, consumed by regret. And then Ghost had appeared. "He came to me on the darkest night of my life," Margaret had written. "I was standing at the edge of the cliff, ready to jump, ready to end the pain. And there he was, this magnificent white horse, blocking my path. He wouldn't let me pass. He stayed with me all night, and by morning I had decided to live, to atone, to make sure that no one else ever suffered because I was too cowardly to help." Thomas closed the journal, his hands shaking. He looked at Ghost, understanding now why the horse had led him to the baby in the snow. This was about redemption, about second chances, about making right what had once gone terribly wrong. "Margaret couldn't save her daughter or her granddaughter," Thomas said, his voice thick with emotion. "But through Ghost, she's been trying to save others. And now Ghost is continuing that mission." Sarah moved closer to the makeshift grave marker, her eyes glistening with tears that had nothing to do with the cold wind. She knelt in the snow, placing her hand on the stone that marked baby Grace's resting place. "All these years I've lived here, and I never knew. I never knew about Margaret's pain, about what she went through." Thomas felt a weight settling on his shoulders, the familiar burden of understanding tragedy too well. He had seen so much death in Afghanistan, had held dying soldiers in his arms, had written letters to families who would never see their loved ones again. He knew the particular kind of guilt that came from surviving when others didn't, from making choices that seemed right in the moment, but haunted you forever afterward. Margaret tried to make amends, Thomas said quietly, looking at Ghost, who stood watching them with those ancient knowing eyes. She spent the rest of her life trying to save others because she couldn't save her own family. And somehow, this horse became part of that mission. "But how?" Sarah asked, standing up and brushing snow from her knees. "How can a horse do this? How can it know when someone needs help, where to find them, how to bring help to them? It defies everything we know about animal behavior." Thomas had no answer that would satisfy the rational mind. In his years of combat, he had learned that the world contained mysteries that couldn't be explained by science or logic alone. He had seen things in the mountains of Afghanistan that the official reports could never capture, moments of inexplicable grace or terror that existed outside the boundaries of normal understanding. "Maybe it doesn't matter how," Thomas said. "Maybe what matters is that it happens. That baby I found today, she would be dead if I hadn't gone down that trail. And I only went that way because something pushed me in that direction. Call it intuition, call it fate, call it whatever you want. But that child is alive because of it." Ghost took a few steps closer to them, his massive presence somehow comforting rather than threatening. The horse lowered his head, and Thomas reached out to stroke the powerful neck. The white coat was thick and warm beneath his cold fingers, real and solid. Whatever Ghost was, whatever explained his abilities, he was undeniably present and undeniably connected to what was happening. "We should get back inside," Sarah said, shivering as a particularly strong gust of wind swept through the area. "The baby needs to be checked on, and we're not doing anyone any good freezing out here." They made their way back to the main house, Ghost following at a respectful distance. When they reached the porch, the horse stopped and stood watching the house, making no move to come closer. Thomas paused at the door, looking back at the magnificent animal. "Are you going to stay?" Thomas asked, feeling slightly foolish for speaking to a horse as if it could answer. Ghost simply stared back, unmoving except for the steady rise and fall of his breathing and the occasional flick of his ears. Inside, the warmth of the house enveloped them. Thomas checked on the baby first, relieved to find her still sleeping peacefully in the makeshift bed Sarah had created. The infant's color was good, her breathing steady and strong. Whatever ordeal she had endured in the snow, she seemed to be recovering well. Sarah put on a fresh pot of coffee while Thomas dried off by the fire. The events of the day were catching up with him, exhaustion settling into his bones. He glanced at the clock and was shocked to see that only 3 hours had passed since he had found the baby. It felt like a lifetime. The phone rang, startling them both. Sarah answered it, and Thomas listened to her side of the conversation. It was Sheriff Morrison calling to update them on the situation. The roads were completely impassable now, and it would be at least until morning before anyone could reach the rescue center. He asked about the baby's condition, and Sarah assured him that the infant was stable and safe. When she hung up, Sarah relayed the information to Thomas. "We're on our own until the storm passes. The sheriff said they'll send someone first thing in the morning, assuming the roads are clear enough." Thomas nodded, accepting this news with the same calm he had learned to maintain during military operations, when plans changed and adaptability was essential. "Then we make sure she stays safe and comfortable until then." The evening passed slowly. Thomas and Sarah took turns watching over the baby, feeding her when she woke, changing her diaper with supplies from Sarah's first aid kit. They were both uncomfortable with the task, neither having much experience with infants, but they managed. The baby seemed content, her cries limited to when she was hungry or needed changing. As night fell completely and the storm showed no signs of abating, Thomas found himself standing at the window, staring out into the darkness. He could barely see anything through the falling snow, but he knew Ghost was out there somewhere. The horse's presence was palpable even when invisible. "You're thinking about keeping her, aren't you?" Sarah said from behind him. Thomas turned to find her standing in the doorway, a knowing look on her face. "I don't know what I'm thinking," Thomas admitted. "I know the rational thing is to let social services take her, find her a proper home with people who know how to raise a child. But when I hold her, Sarah, when I look at her, I feel something I haven't felt in years. Like maybe there's a reason I survived everything I went through. Like maybe I'm supposed to be here for her." Sarah walked over to stand beside him at the window. "Thomas, I understand that feeling. But raising a child alone, especially with what you're dealing with, the nightmares, the isolation, it's not going to be easy. That baby deserves stability, a family who can give her everything she needs. I know, Thomas said, his voice barely above a whisper. But what if I'm what she needs? What if this whole thing, finding her in the snow, Ghost leading me there, Margaret's story, what if it's all connected? What if I'm supposed to give her the chance that Margaret couldn't give her granddaughter? Those are big questions, Sarah said gently, and they're not going to be answered tonight. Get some rest. Tomorrow the authorities will come, and you'll have decisions to make. But right now, that baby is safe and warm, and that's what matters. Thomas knew Sarah was right, but sleep seemed impossible. His mind was too full of questions and possibilities, of the weight of decisions that loomed on the horizon. He thought about Margaret Harrison, about her guilt and her attempts at redemption. He thought about the soldiers he had lost, about the lives he couldn't save. And he thought about the tiny baby sleeping peacefully in the next room, a life he had saved. Around midnight, Thomas finally dozed off in the armchair near the fireplace, exhaustion overcoming his restless thoughts. He slept fitfully, his dreams a confused mixture of snow and horses and the cries of infants. He woke several times throughout the night, checking on the baby, adding wood to the fire, staring out at the storm that continued to rage outside. Dawn broke with surprising gentleness. The storm had exhausted itself sometime in the early morning hours, leaving behind a world transformed by snow. Thomas woke to find pale sunlight streaming through the windows, illuminating dust motes that danced in the golden beams. For a moment, he was disoriented, unsure where he was or why his back ached from sleeping in a chair. Then he heard the soft coo of the baby from the examination room, and everything came rushing back. He stood up, joints protesting, and made his way to check on the infant. She was awake, her dark eyes tracking the movement of shadows on the ceiling. When she saw Thomas, she made a small sound that might have been recognition or might have been coincidence, but it made his heart clench nonetheless. He picked her up carefully, supporting her head the way Sarah had shown him, and carried her to the kitchen. Sarah was already there, having apparently slept on the couch in her office. She looked as tired as Thomas felt, but she managed to smile when she saw him with the baby. "Good morning. The roads should be clear enough soon. I called Sheriff Morrison about an hour ago. He said they're sending someone from social services along with one of his deputies." Thomas nodded, trying to ignore the sinking feeling in his stomach. Of course. That's what needs to happen. He looked down at the baby in his arms, at the tiny fingers that had curled around his thumb. She needs a real home, a real family. Sarah prepared another bottle while Thomas held the baby. The morning routine felt oddly natural, as if he had been doing this for months rather than less than a day. When the bottle was ready, he settled into a chair and began feeding the infant. She drank eagerly, her small body warm and trusting against his chest. Through the window, Thomas could see the property blanketed in pristine white snow. The storm had deposited at least 2 feet, maybe more in some drifts, and there, standing at the edge of the tree line like a statue carved from ivory, was Ghost. The massive white horse was watching the house, patient and still, as if waiting for something. "He's still here," Thomas said, gesturing toward the window with his chin. Sarah came over to look, her expression a mixture of wonder and concern. "I've been thinking about what we read in Margaret's journal," Sarah said quietly, "about how Ghost appears when someone needs help. Maybe his job here is done. You found the baby, she's safe, and now she'll go to people who can care for her properly. Maybe Ghost will leave now." Thomas considered this, but something felt incomplete about that explanation. Ghost had shown them Margaret's story, had led them to the grave of baby Grace. There had been purpose in every action the horse had taken. Thomas didn't believe that purpose ended simply with the baby being found. There was something more, some lesson or message that hadn't yet been delivered. The sound of vehicles approaching broke the morning quiet. Thomas looked out to see a sheriff's department SUV and another official vehicle making their way carefully up the snow-covered driveway. His time with the baby was ending. The real world, with its procedures and protocols and proper channels, was arriving to take over. Sheriff Morrison was a burly man in his late 50s, with a graying mustache and kind eyes. He stomped snow off his boots on the porch before entering, followed by a younger deputy and a woman in her 40s who introduced herself as Linda Chen from Social Services. No relation to Sarah, she clarified with a small smile, though they had met before through Sarah's rescue work. The officials were efficient, but not unkind. They asked Thomas to recount how he had found the baby, taking notes and asking clarifying questions. Where exactly on Rocky Creek Trail? What time approximately? Had he seen anyone else in the area? Thomas answered as thoroughly as he could, leaving out only the parts about Ghost and Margaret's journal. Those elements felt private, sacred somehow, not meant for official reports. Linda examined the baby with professional competence, checking her over thoroughly and documenting her condition. "She's in remarkably good shape considering her ordeal," Linda said. "You did well in getting her here quickly and keeping her warm. Another hour in those conditions, and we'd be having a very different conversation." "Do you know who she is?" Thomas asked. "Who left her there?" Linda shook her head. "We're investigating, but so far we have no leads. There was no missing person report filed, no abandoned vehicle in the area. Whoever left her covered their tracks well, or they weren't from around here. We'll keep searching, but these cases can be difficult. Sometimes we never find the parents. What happens to her now?" The question came out before Thomas could stop himself, revealing more emotion than he intended. Linda's expression softened. "She'll go into the foster care system while we search for relatives or try to identify the parents. If no family is found, she'll eventually be put up for adoption. She's young and healthy, so she'll have a good chance of finding a permanent home." Thomas felt Sarah's hand on his shoulder, a silent gesture of support and understanding. He watched as Linda prepared to take the baby, gathering the infant into a carrier they had brought. The baby, who had been so content in Thomas's arms, began to fuss and cry as she was moved to the unfamiliar carrier. "Can I?" Thomas started, then stopped, unsure how to voice what he wanted. "Can I hold her one more time before you go?" Linda hesitated, then nodded. "Of course. Just for a moment." Thomas took the baby back into his arms, and miraculously she calmed immediately. He looked down at her tiny face, memorizing every detail, the small nose, the delicate eyebrows, the way her mouth made little sucking motions even when she wasn't eating. He thought about Margaret Harrison, about the granddaughter she never got to know, about the lifetime of regret that had consumed her. "I'm sorry I can't keep you safe," Thomas whispered to the baby, knowing the others in the room could hear but not caring. "I wish I could. I wish I was the kind of person who could give you a home." "Thomas," Sarah said gently, "you can be. You could apply to foster her, maybe even adopt if no family is found. It's not impossible." Thomas looked at Sarah, then at Linda, who was watching him with an expression of professional neutrality that couldn't quite hide the empathy underneath. "A man like me," Thomas said, "living alone in a cabin, dealing with PTSD, no experience with children, they'd never approve me." "You'd be surprised," Linda said carefully. "We look for people who genuinely care, who are committed to providing a stable environment. The rest can be learned. If you're serious about this, there's a process. It's not quick or easy, but it exists." Thomas handed the baby back to Linda, his arms feeling suddenly empty. "I need to think about it. This is all happening so fast." The officials gathered their things and prepared to leave. Sheriff Morrison paused at the door, looking at Thomas with an appraising expression. "What you did yesterday, finding that baby in the storm, that took courage and quick thinking. Not many people would have gone out in that weather, and even fewer would have known what to do. That child owes you her life. After they left, the house felt too quiet. Thomas stood at the window, watching the vehicles disappear down the driveway. Ghost was still there at the tree line, and now the massive horse began to move, walking slowly toward the house with that same purposeful gait. Thomas watched as Ghost approached the house, each step deliberate and measured. The morning sun caught the horse's white coat, making it shine like fresh snow. Sarah joined Thomas at the window, both of them silent as they observed the magnificent animal's approach. When Ghost reached the porch, he stopped and stood there, his dark eyes fixed on Thomas through the glass. "I think he wants you to come out," Sarah said softly. Thomas didn't question the statement. He grabbed his jacket and stepped outside into the cold morning air. The sky was a brilliant blue, the kind of crystalline clarity that only comes after a major storm. The world felt scrubbed clean, pristine, and new. Ghost waited patiently as Thomas descended the porch steps, and when the man was standing before him, the horse lowered his massive head until it was level with Thomas's chest. Thomas reached out and placed both hands on either side of Ghost's face, feeling the warmth of the animal's skin beneath the thick coat. For a long moment they simply stood there, man and horse, connected in a way that defied explanation. Thomas felt something shift inside him, a wall he had built around his heart beginning to crack. "I don't know what to do," Thomas said aloud, speaking to Ghost as if the horse could understand every word. "I want to help that baby. I want to give her a home, a chance at a good life. But I'm broken, Ghost. I wake up screaming from nightmares. I can't hold down a normal job. I can't even maintain relationships with other people. How can I possibly raise a child?" Ghost pulled back slightly and made a soft sound, almost like a sigh. Then the horse turned and began walking away from the house, moving toward the tree line. He walked a few paces, stopped, and looked back at Thomas. The invitation was clear. Thomas followed without hesitation. They walked through the snow-covered property, Ghost breaking trail with his powerful legs, while Thomas followed in the path the horse created. They passed the stable, past the area where Margaret's cabin had stood, and continued into the forest beyond. The trees were heavy with snow, their branches bent under the weight, creating a cathedral-like space beneath their canopy. Ghost led Thomas deeper into the woods, to a place Thomas had never explored before. They came to a clearing where a small frozen stream cut through the landscape. On the far side of the stream stood a structure that Thomas hadn't known existed, a small log cabin, old but sturdy, almost completely hidden by the surrounding forest. The horse stopped at the edge of the clearing and waited. Thomas understood. This was something he needed to see. He crossed the frozen stream carefully, testing each step before putting his full weight down. When he reached the cabin, he found the door was unlocked. He pushed it open and stepped inside. The interior was dusty and cold, but it was clear someone had lived here once. There was a simple bed frame in one corner, a small wood stove, a table with 2 chairs. On the walls were photographs, dozens of them, showing Margaret Harrison at various stages of her life. But what caught Thomas's attention were the newer additions, photographs that appeared to have been taken in the last 15 years of Margaret's life. They showed Margaret working with people, homeless individuals, recovering addicts, runaway teenagers. Each photograph captured a moment of connection, of help being offered and received. Beneath each photo was a small notation in Margaret's handwriting, giving the date and a brief description. John found him sleeping in the barn, got him into rehab. Sarah, no relation to the current Sarah, runaway from an abusive home, connected her with safe housing. Michael, struggling veteran, helped him find counseling and a job. Thomas moved from photograph to photograph, reading each notation. The cabin walls were covered with these stories, these lives that Margaret had touched and changed. At the center of it all was a larger photograph of Ghost, standing proud and magnificent, with Margaret beside him. Beneath this central image, Margaret had written in larger script, "This is how we make amends, not by erasing the past, but by creating a better future." Thomas felt tears stinging his eyes, the first real tears he had shed in years. He understood now what Ghost had brought him here to see. Margaret's story wasn't just about her guilt and regret. It was about what she had done with that guilt, how she had transformed it into purpose. She hadn't been able to save her daughter or granddaughter, but she had saved countless others. The door creaked open behind him, and Thomas turned to find Sarah standing there, slightly out of breath from the hike through the snow. "I saw you heading into the woods," she said. "I wanted to make sure you were okay." Thomas gestured around the cabin. "Did you know about this place? About what Margaret was doing?" Sarah shook her head, her eyes widening as she took in the photographs and notations. "I knew she had been involved in some community outreach before she died, but I had no idea it was to this extent. She saved so many people. She was trying to save herself," Thomas said quietly, "trying to find redemption for what she couldn't change." He turned to look at Sarah, and she could see the emotion raw on his face. "I understand that need, Sarah. I understand it so well it hurts." Sarah moved closer, looking at the photographs with new understanding. "You think you need redemption too, for the soldiers you lost, for the people you couldn't save." Thomas nodded, not trusting himself to speak. He thought about the faces that haunted his dreams, the young men and women who had died under his command or beside him in battle. He thought about the civilians caught in crossfire, the children's eyes that still stared at him from his memories. He had been carrying that weight for years, letting it crush him slowly. "But Margaret found a way forward," Sarah said gently. "She didn't let her guilt destroy her. She used it as fuel to help others. And maybe that's what you're being called to do now, Thomas. Maybe that baby isn't just someone you happen to find. Maybe she's your chance to create something good from all the pain you've experienced." Thomas walked to the window of the cabin and looked out. Ghost was standing in the clearing, waiting patiently. The sun was higher now, casting the horse's shadow long across the snow. Thomas thought about Linda's words, about the possibility of fostering the baby, maybe even adopting her if no family was found. The idea terrified him. He had spent so long convinced he was too damaged to be of use to anyone. But looking at Margaret's wall of photographs, at the evidence of all the good she had done despite her own brokenness, Thomas began to wonder if maybe he had been wrong. Maybe being broken didn't disqualify him from helping others. Maybe, in fact, it was precisely his brokenness that would allow him to understand and nurture another damaged soul. "I'm scared," Thomas admitted to Sarah. "I'm scared I'll fail her, that I'll let her down like I let down so many others." Sarah put her hand on his shoulder. "Fear is natural. But you know what I see when I look at you, Thomas? I see a man who walked into a blizzard and saved a child's life. I see someone who has survived hell and is still trying to do good in the world. That baby could do a lot worse than having you in her corner." They spent another hour in Margaret's hidden cabin, reading through the notebooks she had left behind, detailing her work with people in crisis. Each entry was a testament to patience, to showing up day after day even when progress seemed impossible. Margaret had documented her failures as honestly as her successes, and Thomas found comfort in that honesty. She hadn't pretended to be perfect or to have all the answers. She had simply tried, repeatedly, to make a difference. When they finally left the cabin and returned to the main house, Thomas felt different. The weight he had been carrying hadn't disappeared, but it felt more bearable somehow, as if he had learned how to distribute it more evenly across his shoulders. Ghost walked alongside them through the forest, his presence no longer mysterious, but companionable, like an old friend who understood without needing explanations. Back at the house, Sarah made lunch while Thomas sat by the fire, lost in thought. He pulled out his phone and stared at the contact information Linda from social services had left with him. All he had to do was make a call, express his interest in fostering the baby, and start the process, but his finger hovered over the screen, hesitation warring with determination. "What's holding you back?" Sarah asked, setting a sandwich in front of him. Thomas put the phone down. "Everything. The practical concerns mostly. I live in a one-room cabin with no running water. I survive on disability payments and odd jobs. I have nightmares that wake me up screaming. How can I provide a stable environment for a child when I can barely maintain stability for myself?" Sarah sat down across from him, her expression thoughtful. "Those are legitimate concerns, but they're also not insurmountable. You could move. There are programs for veterans that help with housing. You're already in therapy, even if you don't talk about it much. And as for the financial side, foster parents receive support. More importantly, children need love and commitment more than they need perfect circumstances." Thomas picked up the sandwich but didn't eat it. "What if I make things worse? What if my issues damage her? What if they don't?" Sarah countered. "What if your experiences, difficult as they were, give you empathy and understanding that other parents wouldn't have? What if the fact that you know what it's like to be abandoned, to be lost and afraid, makes you exactly the right person to care for a child who was literally abandoned in the snow?" The words hit Thomas harder than he expected. He had never thought about his trauma as potentially useful, as something that could be transformed into understanding rather than just pain. He looked out the window to where Ghost stood in the yard, the massive horse seeming to glow in the afternoon sunlight. "Margaret wrote something in one of her notebooks," Thomas said quietly. "She said that we don't heal from our wounds by pretending they don't exist. We heal by using them to understand others who are wounded, by turning our scars into maps that help guide people through their own darkness." Sarah smiled. "That sounds like wisdom earned the hard way." Thomas finally took a bite of his sandwich, chewing thoughtfully. "If I do this, if I try to foster her, I need to do it right. I need to be honest with social services about my PTSD, about my limitations. I can't pretend to be something I'm not." "That's exactly the right approach," Sarah said. "Honesty is what they're looking for. They want to know you're self-aware and committed to working on your challenges, not that you're perfect." They finished lunch in comfortable silence, and then Thomas picked up his phone again. This time he didn't hesitate. He dialed Linda's number and waited as it rang. When she answered, he took a deep breath and began to speak. "Linda, this is Thomas Mitchell. I wanted to talk to you about the baby I found yesterday. I want to apply to foster her." The conversation that followed was longer and more detailed than Thomas expected. Linda asked questions about his living situation, his mental health, his support system. Thomas answered honestly, holding nothing back. He told her about his PTSD, about the nightmares, about the isolation he had chosen after leaving the military, but he also told her about his determination to change, about his willingness to get whatever help he needed to provide a good home for the child. Linda listened carefully, taking notes. "I appreciate your honesty, Thomas. The fact that you're upfront about your challenges actually works in your favor. It shows self-awareness and a commitment to doing what's best for the child. I can't make any promises, but I can start the paperwork and get the process moving. You'll need to attend some training sessions, undergo a home study, get references. It's not a quick process." "I understand," Thomas said. "I'm willing to do whatever it takes." After he hung up, Thomas felt both exhilarated and terrified. He had taken the first step, but there was a long road ahead. Sarah congratulated him with a hug, and they spent the rest of the afternoon discussing practical matters. Thomas would need to find better housing, something suitable for a child. He would need to prepare financially for the expenses of raising an infant. He would need to build a support network, people who could help when things got difficult. As evening approached, Thomas went outside to check on Ghost. The white horse was still there, grazing peacefully on the sparse vegetation he could find beneath the snow. When Thomas approached, Ghost lifted his head and regarded him with those intelligent dark eyes. "Thank you," Thomas said simply. "I don't know if you understand me or if you're really what Margaret's journal suggested, but thank you for leading me to that baby. Thank you for showing me Margaret's story. Thank you for helping me see that maybe I'm not as broken as I thought I was." Ghost took a step closer and allowed Thomas to rest his hand on the powerful neck. They stood together as the sun began to set, painting the snow-covered landscape in shades of orange and pink. Thomas felt a peace settling over him that he hadn't experienced in years, not the absence of pain or fear, but the acceptance of both, and the determination to move forward despite them. That night, Thomas dreamed, but for the first time in months, the dreams weren't nightmares. He dreamed of the baby, grown into a little girl with dark eyes and a bright smile. He dreamed of teaching her to ride a bicycle, of reading her bedtime stories, of watching her grow and flourish. In the dream, Ghost was always nearby, a silent guardian watching over them both. When Thomas woke the next morning, the sun was streaming through Sarah's windows with cheerful intensity. He got up and looked outside, half expecting to see Ghost still standing watch in the yard. But the white horse was gone. The only evidence of his presence were the deep hoof prints in the snow, already beginning to fill with fresh powder from a light morning snowfall. Thomas felt a moment of sadness at Ghost's departure, but also understanding. The horse had done what he came to do. He had guided a lost soul toward purpose, just as he had done for Margaret, and probably countless others over the years. Ghost's mission, at least for now, was complete. Sarah was already up making coffee in the kitchen. She looked out the window and saw the empty yard. "He's gone," she observed. Thomas nodded. "His work here is done. I know what I need to do now." The following weeks were a whirlwind of activity. Thomas worked with a Veterans Assistance Program to find suitable housing, a small 2-bedroom house in town that was affordable and close to schools and services. He attended the required foster parent training classes, sitting in rooms with other prospective foster parents and learning about child development, trauma-informed care, and the practical realities of caring for an infant. At first, Thomas felt out of place among the couples and families, a single man with obvious scars, both visible and invisible. But as the weeks progressed, he found himself connecting with the material in unexpected ways. The discussions about helping children feel safe after experiencing abandonment or trauma resonated deeply with his own experiences of trying to find safety after war. The home study was thorough and sometimes uncomfortable. A social worker named Patricia came to inspect his new house, asking detailed questions about his daily routines, his mental health treatment, his support system. Thomas answered everything honestly, showing her the bedroom he had prepared for the baby, the safety measures he had installed, the stack of parenting books he had been reading. Patricia was professional but warm, and Thomas got the sense that she appreciated his straightforward approach. "Your honesty about your PTSD is actually reassuring," Patricia told him during one visit. "We see a lot of applicants who try to present a perfect facade. The fact that you're actively addressing your challenges and building a support network shows real commitment. No parent is perfect, Thomas. What matters is that you're willing to work on yourself and put the child's needs first." Through it all, Sarah was a constant source of support. She helped Thomas shop for baby supplies, teaching him the difference between various types of formula and explaining what size diapers an infant would need. She connected him with other veterans in the area who had successfully transitioned to civilian family life, creating a network of people who understood both his struggles and his goals. Thomas also reconnected with his therapist, a patient woman named Dr. Rivera, who specialized in treating combat-related PTSD. He had been seeing her sporadically for the past year, often canceling appointments or going weeks between sessions. But now he committed to weekly therapy, working through the memories and guilt that had been haunting him. He told Dr. Rivera about finding the baby, about Ghost and Margaret's story, about his desire to become a foster parent. "This could be incredibly healing for you," Dr. Rivera said thoughtfully. "But I want you to be realistic about the challenges. Caring for an infant is exhausting even for people without PTSD. The sleep deprivation, the constant demands, the responsibility, it can all be triggering. We need to develop strategies for managing your symptoms while also caring for a child." They worked on those strategies together, creating routines that would help Thomas stay grounded, identifying his triggers and developing coping mechanisms, building a crisis plan for times when the nightmares or anxiety became overwhelming. Thomas threw himself into the work with a dedication he hadn't felt in years. For the first time since leaving the military, he had a mission that felt worthy of his effort. 2 months after finding the baby in the snow, Thomas received a call from Linda. The investigation into the baby's origin had hit dead ends. No missing person reports matched, no one had come forward to claim the child, and DNA testing had yielded no matches in any database. The baby was, for all legal purposes, abandoned and in need of a permanent home. Thomas's application to foster her had been approved. "When can I see her?" Thomas asked, his heart racing. "How about tomorrow?" "How?" Linda replied. "We can do the placement then if you're ready." Thomas spent that evening preparing with a thoroughness that would have made his old drill sergeant proud. He checked and rechecked every detail of the nursery, made sure he had adequate supplies of formula and diapers, tested the car seat installation 3 times. Sarah came over with a casserole and words of encouragement, staying late into the evening to help him calm his nerves. "You're going to be a wonderful father," Sarah said as she was leaving. "That baby is lucky to have you." The next morning, Thomas dressed carefully and drove to the social services office. His hands were shaking as he parked the truck, and he had to take several deep breaths before going inside. Linda met him in the lobby with a warm smile and led him to a small room where the baby waited in her carrier. "She's been doing well," Linda said. "Growing right on schedule, hitting all her developmental milestones. The foster family who's been caring for her these past 2 months has done a great job." She handed Thomas a folder of paperwork. "Here's everything you need to know about her schedule, her preferences, medical information." Thomas barely heard the words. He was focused on the baby, who was awake and looking around with curious dark eyes. When she saw him, something shifted in her expression. Not quite recognition, she was too young for that, but perhaps a sense of familiarity. Thomas reached down and carefully lifted her from the carrier, and the moment her small weight settled into his arms, he felt something click into place inside his chest. "Hello there," he whispered. "Remember me? I'm the one who found you in the snow, and I'm going to make sure you're never cold or alone again." The baby made a small cooing sound and wrapped her tiny fingers around his thumb with surprising strength. Thomas felt tears sliding down his face, but he didn't care. This was right. This was what he was supposed to do. All the pain, all the loss, all the years of feeling broken and useless, they had led him to this moment. They had prepared him to be exactly what this child needed. The drive home was careful and slow, Thomas hyper-aware of the precious cargo in the back seat. When he pulled up to his house, Sarah was waiting on the porch with a small crowd of neighbors who had come to welcome the baby. There were gifts, offers of help, warm wishes from people Thomas had barely spoken to in the 3 years he had lived in Whitefish. He realized that by opening himself up to this vulnerability, by asking for help and accepting his need for community, He had allowed others to see him as fully human for the first time. That night, after the visitors had left and the house was quiet, Thomas sat in the rocking chair in the nursery, holding the sleeping baby. The nightlight cast soft shadows on the walls, and through the window he could see the moon rising over the mountains. He thought about Margaret Harrison and her lifetime of trying to atone. He thought about the soldiers he had lost and the guilt he would probably always carry. He thought about Ghost, wherever that magnificent creature might be, continuing his mysterious mission of guiding lost souls toward purpose. "You saved me," Thomas whispered to the baby. "I know everyone says I saved you, and maybe I did pull you out of that snow, but you saved me too. You gave me a reason to keep going, to be better, to try." In the weeks that followed, Thomas discovered that Sarah and Dr. Rivera had been right about the challenges. The sleep deprivation was brutal, triggering anxiety and making his PTSD symptoms worse. There were nights when the baby's cries blended with the memories of screams from the battlefield, when Thomas had to step outside and call someone from his support network to talk him down. But there were also moments of pure grace. The first time the baby smiled at him, the way she calmed when he sang old folk songs his grandmother had taught him. The ordinary miracle of watching her grow and change day by day. 6 months later, on a bright spring morning, Thomas took the baby for a walk in the stroller. They followed the trail that wound through the forest behind town, enjoying the warmth of the sun and the sound of birds returning from their winter migration. As they rounded a bend, Thomas saw something that made him stop. There, standing in a clearing bathed in golden light, was Ghost. The white horse looked exactly as he had that snowy day 6 months ago, magnificent and otherworldly. Thomas stood frozen, holding his breath, wondering if the horse was real or if he had finally lost his grip on reality. Ghost took a few steps forward and lowered his head, looking first at Thomas and then at the baby in the stroller. The infant, who had been fussing, went completely still, her eyes wide as she stared at the massive animal. For a long moment, the three of them existed in perfect silence, connected by something Thomas couldn't name but could definitely feel. Then Ghost lifted his head, turned, and walked calmly back into the forest, disappearing among the trees, as if he had never been there at all. Thomas looked down at the baby, who was now smiling and reaching her small hands toward where the horse had vanished. "Did you see that?" Thomas asked her softly. "That was the horse who helped me find you. That was Ghost." The baby made a happy sound, and Thomas laughed, feeling lighter than he had in years. He resumed walking, pushing the stroller along the forest path. Behind him, barely visible in the dappled sunlight, a set of hoof prints marked the ground before slowly fading into the earth.